Hey guys, tonight we begin with the deliciously questionable world of ancient Roman street food. From greasy thermopolia counters to honey-soaked fig cakes eaten in the shadows of marble columns, Roman junk food wasn't just fuel. It was flavor, status, and survival, all rolled into one mystery sausage. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're trudging through a sun-baked Roman street in your worn-out sandals, your tunic clinging to you in all the wrong places, and you're nursing the kind of headache that only comes from drinking 5 cups of watered-down wine and making bad decisions at the bathhouse. You're not in the mood for a formal meal. You're not about to spit roast a pig or debate olive varieties with your neighbour. No, you need something immediate, greasy, possibly regrettable. Something that won't ask too many questions, and won't mind if you eat it with one hand while using the other to shoo away pigeons. Enter the Thermopolium, Rome's gloriously chaotic take on a street food joint. Think ancient Taco Bell, but with more marble counters and slightly fewer food regulations. The layout is deceptively simple. Stone counters with circular holes carved into them, each containing a dolia. Large earthenware pots filled with whatever was hot, edible, and survived the morning. No menus, no labels, no real sense of order. Just a bubbling stew of possibility, both literal and gastrointestinal. What's on offer? Fried cheese balls that squeak when you bite them. Questionable sausage links that might be pork, or might be optimism. A mysterious stew that may contain lentils, or may just look like it does. And floating in everything, like a ghost you can taste. Garum, the Roman fermented fish sauce that was somehow both seasoning and social experiment. Cleanliness? Let's not ask. The chef is wearing the same tunic he slept in, and the spoon he's using has seen at least 2 civil wars. But the food is hot, it's salty, and it's got enough calories to get you through another afternoon of not dying in a crowd. Thermopolia were everywhere, especially in Pompeii, where nearly every block had one. Workers, students, wandering poets, and very confused tourists from Gaul all gathered at these counters, trading sesterces for sustenance that was fast, filling, and questionably legal. And sure, it may give you indigestion. But when the choices are a cold onion or whatever's bubbling at the corner stall, you follow your gut and hope it forgives you later. You've left the Thermopolium with your dignity slightly bruised and a lentil stain forming on your toga. You're walking through the forum now, and your stomach makes that ominous noise again. You need a snack, not a meal, just something to chew while pretending to listen to a public orator rant about wheat subsidies. Enter roasted chickpeas, or as they were known in the Roman streets, Cicer arietinum, which sounds fancy but really translates to rocks pretending to be food. Vendors sold them in clay bowls or little cloth pouches, shouting over each other in a glorious symphony of salesmanship. Hot chickpeas, crunchy chickpeas, chickpeas that may or may not chip your molars. They were roasted over open coals until they reached a consistency somewhere between crisp and gravel. They were salted, heavily, because salt was the Roman answer to everything. Preservation, seasoning, and disguising the taste of regret. And yet, chickpeas were wildly popular. Soldiers munched them on the march. Senators snacked on them between bribes. Children chewed them like they were practicing for adulthood. They were cheap, filling, and didn't spoil easily, which made them ideal for tossing into a satchel, a lunchbox, or at someone's head during a gladiator match. There wasn't a lot of variety, no chili lime flavour, no hummus dip, just a bowl of rock-hard legumes, dusted with salt and occasionally served warm, which was somehow considered a luxury. Of course, the Romans swore they were healthy. Chickpeas were said to promote virility, digestion, and deep thoughts, which sounds suspiciously like something a chickpea vendor made up. But hey, if it helped move product, why not? Every now and then, you'd get a soft one, a little chewy, a little mealy, and for a brief moment you'd think, this isn't bad. Then you'd bite the next one and remember that Roman dentistry was still about 1,000 years away from solving this problem. Still, for a handful of coins, you got a snack that travelled well, lasted forever, and gave you something to do with your mouth during long political speeches. And in Rome, that was worth every cracked tooth. Now your stomach's asking for something different. Maybe sweet, maybe soft, maybe less existentially crunchy. You spot a vendor with a tray of golden spheres glistening in the sun. You approach cautiously, because in Rome, sweet things are often deceptive. He hands you one with a wink and says, "Globuli." What are they? Picture deep-fried cheese balls drenched in honey. And no, this is not a Renaissance fair invention. Globuli were a real Roman dessert snack, made by mixing ricotta-style cheese with flour, forming them into balls, deep-frying them in oil, and then soaking them in honey like they've committed a crime against moderation. They were sweet, savoury, and structurally unstable. Bite into one too fast, and hot cheese would launch in the opposite direction. The honey would glue your fingers together, ensuring the rest of your day involved bees, dogs, or awkward hand gestures at passing senators. But make no mistake, globuli were a hit. The recipe appears in Apicius, the closest thing the Romans had to a cookbook, and they were considered a treat suitable for dinner parties, temple festivals, and impressing anyone you were trying to seduce through sugar. The texture? Think outside. Crispy. Inside, molten cheese lava. Taste? Somewhere between dessert and what if cheesecake was aggressive. The Romans didn't believe in restraint when it came to honey, and these things were practically candied cannonballs. And while they weren't exactly street food for the masses, frying cheese in oil required some resources, they did make appearances at more upscale gatherings. Imagine a toga party ending with guests groaning happily, their tunics stained with cheese grease and bees hovering like tiny waiters. One bite could transport you to culinary heaven or send you running to the nearest public fountain for a finger rinse. There was no in-between. So yes, while we moderns have donuts, churros and fried Oreos, the Romans had globuli, and in a way, they beat us to the punch. Deep-frying dairy and covering it in sugar wasn't an innovation. It was a revival. You just had to survive the stickiness. You now crave something a bit more refined, less dripping, more dignified, maybe even elegant. Enter the Roman answer to gourmet dessert, dates stuffed with nuts. Known as dulcia domestica in recipes from Apicius, these little bundles were deceptively simple. Take some fresh dates, sticky, brown, squishy, and already halfway to jam. Remove the pits and cram them full of finely chopped almonds or walnuts. Then drizzle with honey, or roll them in it, or drown them entirely, depending on your social status and disregard for subtlety. At first glance, they look harmless. A rustic little sweet, the kind of thing you'd hand to your grandma and feel proud. But beware. These things were dense. Densely packed, densely flavoured, and, if left out in the sun too long, dense enough to cause dental trauma. Imagine nature's candy, turned into a polite form of edible masonry. They weren't just for nobles, though the rich definitely flaunted them at feasts. Slaves and working-class citizens occasionally got their hands on dried dates too, especially around festivals, when indulgence was briefly encouraged and digestive consequences were quietly ignored. The texture was, well, enthusiastic. The date provided chewy resistance, the nut added a crunchy surprise, and the honey acted as ancient Roman superglue. Eating one often required commitment and privacy. They stuck to your teeth, your hands, your toga, and occasionally your personal relationships, if you took the last one. Nutrition-wise, surprisingly solid. Dates were high in sugar and energy, nuts gave a protein boost, and honey, well, honey just made everything feel fancier. Romans claimed it aided digestion, but let's be honest, they were mostly just thrilled to have something sweet that didn't come with bones in it. As a bonus, these treats travelled well. making them the perfect gift, offering, or last-minute apology. Soldiers carried them into battle. Lovers passed them like edible love notes. And if things got rough, they doubled as throwable objects with just enough heft to make your point. In the empire that conquered the known world, this was one of its most beloved desserts. Sticky, satisfying, and potentially dangerous. Let's take a sharp turn into the slightly unhinged, because if there's one Roman snack that still raises eyebrows today, it's this one: stuffed dormice. Yes, small, fuzzy rodents with big eyes and an unfortunate tendency to end up on elite Roman dinner plates. Think of it as the original tension between awe and Now, to be fair, not everyone was out here eating glorified pet hamsters. This was primarily a rich people thing. Ordinary folks stuck with lentils and boiled onions. But if you were part of the Roman upper crust, the toga-wearing, poetry-quoting, villa-owning kind, you absolutely served dormice to guests. Not out of necessity, but because, well, status. The dormice were fattened in little terracotta jars called gliraria, which is basically a mouse-sized gym with no exit. The goal was to make them nice and plump before stuffing them with minced pork, herbs and nuts. Then they were either roasted, dipped in honey, or both. Because why just cross one culinary line when you can sprint past several? Guests would pick them up delicately, as if pretending not to notice the tail still attached. The flavour was described as nutty, but you can bet that's the kind of thing people say to sound cultured. Realistically, it probably tasted like greasy mouse and bad decisions. And the thing is, they weren't even illegal. In fact, dormice farming was regulated. That's how widespread this practice was. The Romans wrote about it, joked about it, even carved them onto fancy mosaics, as if to say, here lies Gaius. He had money, he had mice. But here's the kicker. Despite the weirdness, they were considered delicacies, like the foie gras of the Roman world. Lavish, controversial, and a little morally ambiguous. So why did they eat them? Because they could. Because they wanted to impress people. Because culinary restraint wasn't really in vogue when you ran the Mediterranean. To us, it sounds horrifying. To them, it was finger food with flair. And in a culture where eating flamingo tongues wasn't even the weirdest part of the menu, a crispy honey-glazed dormouse was practically tame. Naturally, you deserve something comforting, something golden, something that doesn't look back at you. Enter the honey cake, or as the Romans knew it, libum. Now, to be clear, these weren't your modern, soft, fluffy sponge cakes. No one was Instagramming slices of these. Roman honey cakes were dense, weighty, more like a sweet brick than a dessert. And they came in all shapes and levels of chewiness, ranging from pleasantly spongy to requires a dagger. The classic libum recipe, cheese, flour and egg mixed into a thick dough, shaped into a tidy little loaf, and baked on a leaf. Because if you're not baking on foliage, are you even Roman? Once baked, they were drenched in honey, not drizzled, not glazed, drenched. The kind of soak that ruins tunics and friendships when there's only one slice left. Honey was liquid gold in Rome. It was a sweetener, a preservative, a skin ointment, and apparently the answer to, what should we dump on this questionable cake? The result was a sticky, slightly sour, cheesy sweet treat that clung to your fingers and social reputation alike. They were served at religious festivals, family gatherings, and offerings to the household gods, which meant that, occasionally, your breakfast pastry was also a spiritual sacrifice. No pressure. And just like every other Roman dish, there were class layers baked in. Poorer families might use barley or rye, skip the cheese, and use a splash of diluted honey, a cake in technicality only. The rich, of course, added nuts, spices, and enough honey to drown a centurion. But here's the kicker. They were beloved. The kind of thing people remembered from childhood, fought over at banquets, and hoarded like bees in togas. They weren't fancy, they weren't pretty, but they were sweet, sticky, and capable of triggering property disputes. Imagine waking up in ancient Rome. The streets are already noisy. Your neighbour is shouting about overdue amphorae, and your head is pounding from last night's 1 cup of diluted wine that turned into 4. You're groggy, broke, and late. Naturally, you reach for breakfast, but not eggs, not fruit, not even a proper meal. No, you're going with the classic Roman start to the day, stale bread soaked in wine. Yes, it was a thing. Romans called it sopium vinum, which sounds like a spell, but just means bread in wine. Essentially, you took old hardened bread, because fresh bread was either expensive or mysteriously missing, tore it into chunks, and drowned it in whatever wine-like substance was lying around. It wasn't luxurious. It wasn't pretty. It was Roman cereal, minus the milk, sugar, and joy. But it got the job done. The wine softened the rock-hard bread just enough to make it chewable. Red or white didn't matter. If it had fermented grapes in it and was vaguely liquid, it was going in. Occasionally, people added herbs or honey, but that was for special occasions, or if you were trying to impress someone who'd already seen you eat dormice. It was a breakfast of necessity and efficiency. Farmers ate it before a day in the fields. Labourers ate it before hauling bricks in the sun. Philosophers ate it while pretending not to cry in public. If coffee jump-starts modern civilization, this was Rome's lukewarm wine-flavoured equivalent. Of course, the elite mocked it, while secretly indulging in their own versions using aged wine, honeyed bread, and the smug expression of someone pretending to slum it for the experience. But for the average Roman, this was the real start to the day. And here's the twist. Sometimes it wasn't even breakfast. Some people just dipped bread in wine constantly. During meals, during speeches, during casual eavesdropping in the forum. It was a food, a drink, and a lifestyle choice. Was it nutritious? Barely. Was it dignified? Not especially. But it was soft, cheap, and soaked in alcohol, which, in ancient Rome, qualified as a win. Ah, sausages. Humanity's age-old solution to the eternal question, what do we do with the leftover bits? Nowhere was this meat wrangling more enthusiastically embraced than in ancient Rome, where sausage making was less about recipes and more about pushing the boundaries of what could legally be considered food. The Roman version, Lucanica, a sausage named after the region of Lucania, though by the time it hit the stalls of Rome, nobody really cared about geography. What they cared about was that it was salty, greasy, spicy, and suspiciously chewy. Ingredients? Well, that's where things get exciting. Lucanica was often a delightful mystery of pork trimmings, liver, lungs, heart, and possibly things best left undocumented. Seasoned with pepper, cumin, fennel seeds, and a dash of bravado, it was then stuffed into an intestine casing and grilled, fried, or smoked to mask the existential horror within. And Romans loved them. Street vendors grilled them openly on small braziers, releasing clouds of meaty perfume into the already chaotic city air. People would line up, toga askew, coins in hand, waiting for their hot, greasy fix. Athletes ate them for energy. Philosophers ate them and then questioned their own ethics. Children begged for them and immediately regretted it. Of course, sausage quality varied wildly. The ones at imperial feasts might be finely ground and delicately spiced. The ones on the street? Let's just say the less you asked, the happier you were. There were rumours of donkey bits, maybe dog, certainly organs you've never seen on a butcher's chart. Storage was also optimistic. Refrigeration didn't exist, and smoking meat was more art than science. So some sausages aged like fine wine. Others aged like something you'd report to the authorities. Still, they were everywhere, sold at Thermopolia, eaten at arenas, carried into battle. A Roman soldier marching across Gaul could count on 2 things: sore feet and a dried sausage in his pouch. It was calorie-dense, flavour-rich, and durable enough to double as a self-defence weapon if necessary. Let's talk about Roman pancakes, or as they might have called them, flat disappointment with a drizzle of hope. In theory, Alita Dolcia sounds promising. It translates to another sweet and was essentially a basic pancake made from spelt flour, eggs, and milk. Sometimes honey got involved, sometimes not. And that inconsistency alone tells you exactly what kind of emotional roller coaster this food was. You'd mix the batter, pour it into a pan over a fire that may or may not be cooperating, and let the magic happen. Except, Roman magic didn't involve fluffy stacks or maple syrup. These pancakes were thin, dense, and just sturdy enough to qualify as edible flooring. If you were lucky, they'd be fried in a bit of oil and served with a generous helping of honey, maybe a sprinkle of poppy seeds if someone was feeling festive. If you weren't lucky, you got the version with no toppings, no sweetness, and the texture of a legal document. Still, they were popular, cheap, easy to make, and surprisingly versatile. They could be sweet or savoury, eaten hot or cold, served at festivals, funerals, and that awkward space between breakfast and guilt. Romans weren't looking for a breakfast revolution, they just wanted calories that didn't bite back. But make no mistake, if you're imagining a modern pancake with strawberries and whipped cream, adjust your expectations downward immediately. These were the kind of cakes that required strong teeth and low emotional standards, more fuel than food, more endurance snack than indulgent brunch. Yet they had their place. They filled stomachs. They paired decently with wine. They made you feel, however briefly, that you had some control over your life, which in a world of invasions, political backstabbing, and mystery meat sausages was no small comfort. And sometimes, just sometimes, the batter would crisp just right on the edges, the honey would caramelize, and you'd think, this is almost good. That fleeting joy was the Roman pancake's true legacy, setting the bar low enough to be pleasantly surprised. So were they bland? Yes. Were they adored? Somehow, also yes. Because in Rome, even mediocrity had its moment, preferably served with honey. There's a certain honesty in Roman cuisine. They didn't pretend things were fancy. They didn't trim the fat. And when it came to fish, they certainly didn't waste time with tidy fillets or delicate portions. No, they went straight for the bits. Fried, salty, sometimes unrecognizable, always crunchy. Imagine this. You're wandering the docks of Ostia, or maybe just downwind from a fishmonger in the Subura. You catch a whiff of something sizzling, something fishy, something that's probably been sitting out since sunrise. You follow your nose, and there it is, a greasy tray of fried fish parts, lovingly coated in oil, and what might be flour, or might be street dust. No one's sure anymore. What were you getting exactly? Well, fish heads, tails, fins, and anything small enough to toss whole into a pan. Anchovies were a favourite. Sardines, too. Occasionally the Romans would venture into mystery seafood territory and fry whatever creature happened to flop into the net that day. The cooking method was simple. Heat up some oil, toss the fish in, and hope they crisp before they burn. Sprinkle with salt. Maybe a squirt of vinegar if you were feeling aristocratic. Serve it wrapped in a fig leaf or straight into the customer's hand if hygiene was optional, which, let's be honest, it usually was. These little crunchy sea creatures were everywhere. Thermopolia served them. Market stalls shouted about them. Kids bought them as snacks. And everyone knew, if it's been fried hard enough, you don't have to ask what part of the fish it was. Nutritionally, decent. Omega-3s, protein, calcium. From the bones you were absolutely crunching through. And a lingering scent of the Mediterranean that stayed with you for days. But here's the magic. People loved it. Romans weren't looking for elegance. They wanted salt, fat, and crunch. And these fish bits delivered. Loudly. Greasily. In a way that told your stomach, yes, I'm full, and told your dignity, we don't talk about this. By now, you've eaten bread soaked in wine, sausage stuffed with mystery, and a pancake that legally qualifies as a construction material. Maybe you're craving something wholesome, something fruity, something that says, I made a good life decision today. Enter the Roman fig cake, or as some modern historians like to call it, the ancient art of making leftovers look intentional. Figs were everywhere in Rome, abundant, cheap, and so perishable that Romans had roughly 3 hours between ripe and fermented. So what did they do with the extras? They smashed them into fig cakes, little lumps of mashed fig, sometimes mixed with nuts or flour, occasionally shaped into discs, and almost always passed off as dessert. The texture was ambitious, chewy, sticky, and vaguely alarming if stored improperly. The taste? That depended on how long the figs had been sitting in the sun. Best case scenario, rich and naturally sweet. Worst case? A tangy flavour profile one could charitably call surprising. Sometimes they added honey, which helped. Sometimes they didn't, which didn't. Some versions included sesame seeds, creating a snack that stuck to your molars like emotional baggage. Others were wrapped in leaves for easy portability and plausible deniability. But despite their humble beginnings, fig cakes were popular across all classes. Farmers brought them into the fields. Philosophers nibbled them while judging other philosophers. Even the rich liked them, though theirs came adorned with spices and smugness. In festivals, they were often handed out to crowds like ancient granola bars. And because they didn't spoil easily, they became the go-to offering for gods, house spirits, and that one neighbour you didn't like but had to stay polite with. Let's not pretend they were glamorous. Nobody was writing love poems to fig cakes. But they were dense, nutritious, and endlessly adaptable. The culinary equivalent of it'll do. And let's face it, in a society where most desserts either stuck to your hands or tried to escape your plate, the humble fig cake offered a rare kind of stability. It didn't sparkle, it didn't impress, but it also didn't fight back. And sometimes, that's enough. At this point in your Roman culinary journey, you've eaten enough fermented, fried, and honey-drenched material to question your life choices. But don't worry, we haven't yet explored one of Rome's most cherished obsessions: cheese. Specifically, cheese snacks, the kind that could be delightful or instantly regrettable. Cheese in ancient Rome wasn't just a food, it was a philosophy. They had soft cheese, hard cheese, aged cheese, and the kind of cheese that might count as a biological weapon by modern standards. Romans loved to snack on cheese between meals, or more accurately, between other questionable decisions. Let's start with fried cheese patties. A common treat at Thermopylae and taverns, these were made by mashing soft cheese, likely a ricotta-like curd, mixing it with flour or semolina, forming little discs, and frying them in oil until golden. Sounds tasty, right? It was, but only if eaten hot. Let them cool for 5 minutes, and you were suddenly gnawing on something with the texture of an old sandal. Some were sweetened with honey, others had herbs and were aggressively savoury. Occasionally, someone would throw in nuts or dried fruits, which, in theory, sounded inventive, but often ended up tasting like someone accidentally dropped trail mix into a grilled cheese. Now, if you were particularly unlucky, you might encounter aged Roman cheese. This wasn't your delicate French brie or polite cheddar. No, this was hard, pungent, and frequently described as fragrant, which is ancient cook speak for don't inhale too deeply. Some versions were aged until they were more salt than cheese. Others were stored in baskets, left out in the sun, and possibly used to repel unwanted guests. Cheese snacks were everywhere. Served to soldiers, offered at festivals, even gifted during Saturnalia, because nothing says, "I appreciate you," like a block of dairy that could double as a paperweight. They were filling, cheap, and impressively shelf-stable, assuming you didn't mind them fighting back. But for all their inconsistencies, the Romans adored cheese snacks. They were comforting, portable, and only occasionally threatening. In short, they were the mozzarella sticks of the ancient world, just without mozzarella, or sticks. Some civilizations have ketchup, others have hot sauce. Ancient Rome, they had garum, the fermented fish sauce that somehow ended up on, in, or near just about every edible object in the empire. Let's be clear, garum was not subtle, it was not elegant. It was not something you lightly drizzled. It was fermented fish juice, made by stuffing fish guts into clay pots, adding copious salt, and then leaving the entire mixture to sit in the sun until it stopped screaming. The result? A brown, oily, salty, tangy liquid that Romans poured over meats, vegetables, grains, and yes, snacks. Bread dipped in garum? Absolutely. Roasted nuts with garum? Why not? Fried cheese with a splash of garum? You're living dangerously, but that's Roman cuisine for you. And it wasn't just for taste. Garum had social clout. There were different grades, some for the poor, and others so exclusive they were aged longer than your average gladiator. Liquamen, alec, and other variations were sold across the empire, with labels boasting origins, purity, and probably imaginary health benefits. Think of it as the ancient Roman version of organic artisanal soy sauce, but with more intestines. Now, it should be noted that the smell of garum production was so bad, it was legally restricted to outside city limits. That's right. Even in Rome, where sewage flowed freely and public baths were occasionally experimental at best, garum factories were banned from the neighbourhood. But once bottled and shipped, it was gold. Emperors hoarded it. Cooks swore by it. Hungry citizens slathered it on nearly anything that didn't move. It was Rome's favourite flavour bomb, and its most widely tolerated olfactory crime. Did people actually enjoy it? Apparently, yes. They praised it in poems. They included it in cookbooks. They wrote love letters to recipes that began with, "First, drown everything in garum." Was it healthy? Possibly. Was it overwhelming? Always. Did it add something magical to fried street snacks? If you like your magic strong, fishy, and vaguely suspicious, then yes. So when you imagine Roman junk food, don't just picture cheese balls or fig cakes. Picture cheese balls and fig cakes, soaked in fermented fish sauce. Because that's what winning tasted like in Rome. You still crave a snack, something casual, something crunchy, something you can eat with one hand while waving the other dramatically at passing senators. Enter Roman street nuts. Walk through any bustling Roman marketplace, the Forum, the Port at Ostia, the back alleys of Subura, and you'd hear the unmistakable sound of nuts roasting on open coals. Not in the cosy, holiday-scented way, more like the smell of burning street cart mixed with salted temptation. Your choices? Almonds, walnuts, hazelnuts and pine nuts, though the latter could cost a small fortune and possibly your dignity if you dropped them. Most were roasted, lightly salted, and sometimes flavoured with herbs or honey. Simple, addictive, pocket-friendly. Vendors sold them in little paper cones made of recycled wax tablets or papyrus scraps, which occasionally still had grocery lists or bad poetry scribbled on them. Bonus entertainment. And the Romans, they went nuts for nuts. Philosophers munched them while pondering mortality. Gladiators downed them for protein. Drunken party guests tossed them into mouths, and sometimes amphorae, with varying degrees of accuracy. Even the emperors snacked on them, though theirs were peeled, gilded, and likely carried to them on a silver platter by someone with anxiety. Some were even candied. Almonds coated in honey were the closest thing Rome had to peanut brittle, and they were equally capable of cracking a tooth or winning your affection, depending on how fresh they were. Of course, there were downsides. Overeating nuts, especially the garum-dusted kind, could lead to indigestion, social consequences, and dramatic readings of your last will and testament. But that didn't stop anyone, because street nuts were fast, cheap, and deeply satisfying. They were the original Roman vending machine. Insert a coin, receive crunchy joy. No fuss, no mystery meat, no tales, just a handful of salty delight in a city powered by wine, ambition, and low-grade chaos. You've partied like a senator. You've bathed in wine, sung badly at a Saturnalia feast, maybe kissed someone who turned out to be your cousin's slave. It's the morning after. Your toga's on sideways. Your mouth tastes like garum and questionable life choices. You need help. But in Rome, help doesn't come in the form of aspirin or black coffee. No. What you get is a heroic, semi-medicinal snack and the vague hope that Jupiter still loves you. Enter Hangover food, Roman edition. First up is the cure-all wine-soaked bread. Yes, again. Because what better way to fix a wine-induced disaster than with more wine, now absorbed into a stale loaf so dry it threatens to exfoliate your gums? Or maybe you're handed a raw egg stirred into spiced wine, known as posca ovata. Think of it as a proto-protein shake, minus refrigeration, hygiene, or joy. Slug it down and try not to gag while someone older than the Republic insists it restores your humours. Still woozy? Time for a snack platter from Etruscan hell. Olives, garlic, vinegar-soaked onions, and maybe a bite of pickled fish, because nothing clears the sinuses like salty brine and regret. One famous option, fried cabbage with cumin and oil. Supposedly miraculous. Realistically, greasy, pungent, and likely to start more problems than it solves. Roman doctors swore by it. Roman diners mostly swore at it. There were also sweet options, figs with honey and vinegar, or dates soaked in wine and dusted with pepper. These, to be fair, probably did help. They were sugary, hydrating, and just weird enough to distract you from your headache. And if all else failed, you could always go full gladiator. A handful of barley, a raw onion, and a punch to the chest to wake you up. No science, just confidence and shame. Of course, Romans didn't call it a hangover. They called it being troubled in the head, which frankly sounds more accurate. And while their cures were hit or miss, they believed in them. With the same fervour they believed fried dormice were classy. So there you are, hunched over a thermopolium counter, sipping spiced vinegar and chewing cabbage while praying to Bacchus for mercy. Welcome to recovery, Roman style. Before he was the scourge of Rome, before elephants thundered over the Alps, Hannibal Barca was just a boy, wide-eyed, sharp-minded, and already forged in the fire of revenge. The year is around 237 BCE. Carthage, the once proud North African power, has just lost the First Punic War to Rome. And the man nursing that wound deeper than anyone else? Hamilcar Barca, the boy's father. He wasn't just a general. He was a symbol of Carthaginian resilience, fierce, brilliant, and bitterly humiliated by Rome's victory. And he wasn't done fighting. So when Hamilcar prepared to leave for Iberia, what we now call Spain, to rebuild Carthage's strength and carve out a new empire, he took his 9-year-old son with him. But this wasn't a bonding trip. This was indoctrination. Before they departed, legend says Hamilcar brought Hannibal to the temple of Baal and had him place his tiny hand on a bloody sacrificial altar. There, he made his son swear a sacred oath that he would never be a friend to Rome. Not tolerate. Not ignore. Never be a friend. Think about that. Not many kids are raised with math, swordplay, and a lifelong vendetta as their school subjects. But Hannibal wasn't raised like other kids. His classroom was a war camp. His father was his general, and his curriculum was revenge. As they marched into Iberia, Hannibal watched and learned. He saw his father win brutal battles, form shaky alliances, and conquer territory mile by mile. Every Roman ambassador that came sniffing around, Hannibal studied. Every negotiation that fell through, every Carthaginian soldier who bled on foreign soil, he remembered it. By the time Hamilcar died and command passed to Hannibal's brother-in-law, Hasdrubal, the boy was already hardened. When Hasdrubal was assassinated years later, Hannibal, now 26, was voted by the army to take command. Not the Senate, not the elders, the soldiers, the ones who had seen him grow up, fight, and lead. And in that moment, the oath of a child hardened into the mission of a man. Rome may have won the first round, but Hannibal Barca was about to change everything they thought they knew about warfare and about fear. Hannibal didn't wait to warm the commander's seat. The moment he took control of the Carthaginian forces in Iberia, he unleashed a campaign so brutal, so effective, that it would make Rome twitch from across the sea. He began with the tribes of Hispania, fractured, proud, and constantly at each other's throats. Instead of marching in like a conqueror, Hannibal used diplomacy, marriage alliances, and bribery to win some of them over. For the rest, he used steel. Tribes that resisted were crushed with a mix of battlefield brilliance and psychological warfare. Hannibal didn't just fight battles, he staged them. He'd allow one part of his army to feign retreat, only to flank and surround the enemy once they thought they were winning. He played mines as easily as he played swords, and the soldiers loved him for it. Hannibal shared their food, marched alongside them, and fought in the thick of combat. He wasn't some pampered general watching from a gilded chariot. He bled with them. He inspired loyalty the same way he inspired fear in huge, overwhelming doses. As Carthage's power grew in Iberia, Rome began to feel the pressure. They had signed a treaty with Hasdrubal before his death, which said Carthage wouldn't cross the Ebro River. But Hannibal wasn't interested in Roman paperwork. He had a much bigger game in mind. So, he targeted the city of Saguntum, a Roman ally just south of the Ebro. Attacking it wasn't just bold, it was practically a declaration of war. Rome watched nervously, unsure if Carthage would restrain this ambitious young general. Spoiler alert, they didn't. The siege of Saguntum was brutal and efficient. Hannibal starved them, bombarded their walls, and finally overran the city. Survivors were either killed or sold into slavery. Rome had its answer. Hannibal wasn't bluffing, and he wasn't afraid. The Roman Senate was outraged, of course. They demanded Carthage hand over Hannibal for violating the treaty. Carthage's response? A collective shrug. The Senate debated, the nobles bickered, but no one had the guts, or perhaps the desire, to rein him in. Hannibal had become bigger than Carthage, and now, with Iberia under his belt and Rome fuming across the sea, he turned his eyes toward Italy. Not by ship, not through a polite declaration of war, but by doing the impossible. He would bring the war to Rome's doorstep, and he would do it with elephants. When Hannibal announced his plan to invade Italy, not by sea, not by treaty, but by land through the Alps, his officers thought he had lost his mind. The Alps weren't just mountains, they were death traps, snow-covered, treacherous, crawling with hostile tribes. No sane general would attempt it, especially not with thousands of soldiers, pack animals, and a handful of African war elephants. But Hannibal wasn't aiming for sanity. He was aiming for shock and awe. In 218 BCE, he began the most daring military maneuver in ancient history. With an army of around 50,000 men and 37 elephants, Hannibal marched north from Iberia, crossing the Pyrenees, skirmishing with Celtic tribes, and eventually reaching the Rhone River. There, he used rafts and local guides to ferry his elephants across. Yes, elephants on rafts. The logistics alone were insane. Rome was caught flat-footed. They expected him to come by sea, or at worst through the expected coastal routes. But Hannibal was rewriting the rulebook, and he hadn't even reached the Alps yet. When they finally began the Alpine ascent, everything that could go wrong did. Landslides buried equipment. Snow blinded the troops. Altitude sickness, freezing winds, and starvation killed thousands. Supplies ran low, morale plummeted, men began to desert, elephants slipped on the icy paths and plummeted into ravines. One soldier reportedly had to chisel frozen horse hooves free from icy rock with a pickaxe. But Hannibal kept moving. He rallied his men by pointing to the distant plains of Italy, promising them rich farmland, plunder, and revenge against Rome. He used fire to shatter ice, vinegar to weaken rock, and sheer will to drag his army over nature's deadliest obstacles. After 2 harrowing weeks, barely alive and with fewer than half his original force, Hannibal emerged on the other side, into the Po Valley, exhausted, frostbitten, and battered. But in Italy, and Rome, they were horrified. They had never imagined an enemy would knock on their door in such fashion. The Alps weren't supposed to be crossed, let alone with elephants. But Hannibal had done it. It wasn't just a march, It was a message. Rome isn't safe. Nowhere is. I'm here. And he wasn't planning on leaving anytime soon. Hannibal didn't waste time once he hit Italian soil. Even with a diminished force, he immediately began recruiting discontented Gallic tribes in northern Italy, Rome's enemies, and they joined him because Hannibal didn't just promise liberation, he proved it with blood. Rome, stunned but still arrogant, scrambled to send legions to intercept him. Consul Gaius Flaminius took command, burning with the confidence of the Republic. He wanted a swift victory, a glorious one that would restore Roman pride after Hannibal's ridiculous Alpine stunt. But Hannibal had already chosen his battlefield, and it wasn't going to be glorious for anyone in a red cloak. The place was Lake Trasimene, a foggy, narrow valley with water on one side and steep hills on the other. Perfect for an ambush. Hannibal stationed his infantry in front, clearly visible, like bait. He then concealed his cavalry and elite troops in the hills, hidden in the early morning mist. On June 21st, 217 BCE, Flaminius charged in, eager, overconfident, and completely blind to what was coming. As the Romans advanced into the trap, Hannibal sprang the jaws shut. His troops exploded from the hills, slamming into the Roman flanks. Cavalry cut off retreat. The Roman line, stretched thin in the narrow pass, had nowhere to maneuver. It was chaos. Roman soldiers drowned in the lake, were trampled trying to flee, or slaughtered where they stood. Flaminius himself was cut down trying to rally his collapsing army. In just a few hours, 15,000 Romans were dead, thousands more captured. And Hannibal? He didn't lose a single officer. The ambush at Lake Trasimene became the largest and most successful ambush in military history. Rome panicked, streets filled with screams and prayers. Mothers wept. The Senate, in despair, appointed a dictator, Quintus Fabius Maximus, to deal with the crisis. But Hannibal wasn't finished. He had invaded their land, annihilated their legions, and now he roamed Italy like a ghost, impossible to catch, devastating everything in his path. Yet, even after this disaster, Rome refused to negotiate. That was fine with Hannibal. He didn't want peace. He wanted to humiliate them in the one place they thought themselves invincible, on the battlefield, at the heart of their empire. And his deadliest masterpiece was still to come. If Lake Trasimene was Hannibal's masterpiece of ambush, then Cannae was his symphony of annihilation. By 216 BCE, Rome was done playing cautious. No more waiting. No more defensive strategies. They massed the largest army they had ever fielded, around 80,000 men, under the command of consuls Lucius Aemilius Paulus and Gaius Terentius Varro. Twice the size of Hannibal's army. They weren't planning to outwit him. They were planning to crush him with sheer force. Hannibal knew it, and he smiled. He chose the battlefield, a wide plain near the town of Cannae in southern Italy, perfect for cavalry movement and maneuvering. Then, he arranged his troops in a deceptively simple formation. His weakest infantry, mostly Gauls and Spaniards, formed a shallow crescent at the centre. His stronger African infantry waited on the flanks. His cavalry, his real hammer, flanked even wider on both sides. The trap was set. On the morning of battle, the Romans advanced in a dense, powerful column, eager to punch straight through Hannibal's centre. And they did. At first, Hannibal's crescent began to bend inward under pressure, retreating but not breaking. The Roman infantry surged forward, deeper and deeper into the trap, thinking victory was near. That's when the jaws snapped shut. Hannibal's African infantry on the flanks wheeled inward, enveloping the Romans from both sides. His cavalry, having already routed the Roman horsemen, circled back and attacked from the rear. Now the Romans were surrounded, completely. No retreat, no breathing room, just chaos and blood. In the blazing August heat, men suffocated in the crush of bodies. Swords couldn't swing, panic set in, and Hannibal's men systematically slaughtered them, cutting them down in one of the most lopsided massacres in military history. An estimated 50,000, 70,000 Romans died in a single day, more than the entire population of many ancient cities. It was the worst defeat Rome had ever suffered, and remains one of the deadliest battles of all time. And Hannibal, he didn't march on Rome. Not because he couldn't, but because he knew Rome would not fall easily. He needed reinforcements from Carthage, siege equipment, and time. But Carthage hesitated. Even after handing Rome its darkest day, Hannibal stood alone. And Rome, wounded, vengeful, and now very afraid, wasn't planning on letting him go unpunished. After Cannae, Hannibal's name alone could silence a Roman crowd. Mothers used it to frighten their children. Hannibal ad portas. Hannibal is at the gates. And yet strangely, he never entered the city. For 16 years, Hannibal roamed the Italian countryside like a phantom, unbeaten, unpredictable, and completely without reinforcements. He won the loyalty of many southern Italian cities and brought chaos to Rome's allies. But Carthage, for all its riches, refused to send him the support he needed to finish the job. The Senate feared his growing power. His enemies at home whispered about his ambition. They were more comfortable letting him bleed Rome slowly than arming him for a final strike. So, Hannibal was forced to adapt. He became a master of survival, fighting guerrilla-style skirmishes, harassing supply lines, destroying crops, and always staying just out of reach. The Romans, under Fabius Maximus, nicknamed the Delayer, refused to give battle. They shadowed him, avoiding open conflict, starving him of opportunities. But Hannibal still scored victories. He crushed Roman forces at Herdonia, ambushed them in Apulia, and even destroyed entire consular armies that dared to chase him. And he kept doing it without ever losing a major engagement. But time was turning against him. Rome, battered but relentless, adapted. They built more legions, trained new commanders, strengthened their alliances. While Hannibal wandered with a shrinking army, Rome expanded its power like a hydra growing new heads, and the war began to shift elsewhere. Rome invaded Iberia, cutting off Carthaginian supply lines. Hannibal's own brother, Hasdrubal, tried to bring reinforcements by crossing the Alps, just like Hannibal had years before. But Rome intercepted him, crushed his army, and threw Hasdrubal's severed head into Hannibal's camp. That message was clear. You're alone now. Hannibal's dream of breaking Rome from within was fading. He had turned Italy into a graveyard of legions, but without reinforcements, without siege engines, without political backing, he couldn't deliver the final blow. Still, he refused to leave. He had promised his father, as a boy, that he would be no friend to Rome. And he kept that promise every year he remained on their soil. But soon, Rome would come knocking. Not in Italy, but on Carthage's own shores. And Hannibal would have no choice but to go home for the final fight. By 203 BCE, the tide had fully turned. Rome had clawed back from disaster, conquered Hannibal's strongholds in Iberia, and taken the fight directly to North Africa. Leading the charge was Scipio Africanus, a young, brilliant general who had studied Hannibal's tactics obsessively. Rome was no longer content to wait. They wanted Carthage destroyed. And to save itself, the Carthaginian Senate had to do the unthinkable. They summoned Hannibal home. After 16 years of near-mythical campaigning in Italy, Hannibal left the land he had bled for. He returned to Carthage to defend a city that had abandoned him, and to face a man trained in the art of Hannibalic warfare. The final showdown came at Zama in 202 BCE. This time, the armies were nearly evenly matched. Hannibal commanded a force of veterans, levies, and 80 war elephants. Scipio, meanwhile, had disciplined Roman legions and Numidian cavalry, crucially led by Massinissa, a former Carthaginian ally who had switched sides. Hannibal opened the battle with a massive elephant charge. It was meant to shatter the Roman lines. But Scipio had planned for this. He ordered his troops to part, creating corridors that funneled the elephants safely through. The beasts either panicked or passed harmlessly between the Roman ranks. Some even turned back, trampling Hannibal's own lines. What followed was a fierce infantry clash. Hannibal's veterans fought valiantly, even pushing back Rome's front lines. But when Scipio's cavalry returned from the flanks and attacked from behind, just as Hannibal had done at Cannae, the Carthaginian formation collapsed. The roles had reversed. Hannibal, once the master of encirclement, was now its victim. Carthage was forced to surrender. The terms were brutal. They had to give up their fleet, pay a massive indemnity, and promise never to wage war without Rome's permission. Hannibal had lost. But it wasn't just a military defeat, it was the death of a vision. His lifelong mission, to break Rome's grip on the Mediterranean, was shattered in the North African dust. Yet even in defeat, Rome didn't kill him. They feared him too much to make him a martyr. Instead, they let him live, knowing full well they hadn't seen the last of him. Because Hannibal Barca wasn't done making history. Not yet. Hannibal returned to Carthage not as a defeated general, but as a survivor. While Zama had broken Carthage militarily, Hannibal still commanded immense respect. The people saw him not as the man who lost the war, but as the man who nearly won it against impossible odds. So, what did Hannibal do? He reinvented himself. He became a politician. Yes, the man who had once commanded elephants through the Alps now sat in the Carthaginian Senate, rooting out corruption, reforming finances, and trying to repair the shattered state. He slashed taxes, paid off debts, and revitalized Carthage's economy, quickly gaining a reputation as a brilliant, if unpopular, reformer. But Rome wasn't watching from the sidelines. They feared Hannibal's mind more than his sword. A strong Carthage, even a peaceful one, was a threat if Hannibal was at the helm. So Rome accused him, falsely, of conspiring with enemy states. Cornered once again, Hannibal fled. Thus began his second life, the life of a hunted exile. He wandered from court to court, offering his military genius to foreign kings. First to Antiochus III of the Seleucid Empire, Rome's newest rival. Hannibal tried to rally them for another great war, but Antiochus ignored much of his advice, and lost spectacularly. Rome's influence only grew. After Antiochus's defeat, Hannibal kept running. He became a ghost drifting through Asia Minor, pursued constantly by Roman envoys who demanded his surrender at every port. And yet, wherever he went, he left whispers, stories, fear. The name Hannibal still sent chills down Roman spines. Despite his defeats, he remained a symbol of defiance, a one-man rebellion against imperial arrogance. He couldn't raise new armies. He had no homeland, no power, just a brilliant mind, a long shadow, and enemies who never stopped watching him. By now he was in his 60s, grey-haired, worn thin by decades of war and exile. But even then, Hannibal remained sharper than most living generals, and Rome still wasn't satisfied. They wanted him erased, not just from politics or the battlefield, but from the story. So they came for him one final time, and Hannibal, true to character, would not let them have the satisfaction. By the early 180s BCE, Hannibal had become a living legend and a liability, not just to Rome, but to every kingdom that dared to shelter him. He was now hiding in Bithynia, a small kingdom in Asia Minor, ruled by King Prusias III. Hannibal, ever the strategist, helped the king win a naval battle using a trick straight out of his playbook. Catapults loaded with clay jars filled with venomous snakes, launched onto enemy ships to sow chaos and fear. Even in his final years, his mind was still 2 moves ahead. But Rome didn't care about snake jars. They wanted Hannibal gone, forever. They pressured Prusias, sent emissaries, and made threats. Eventually, word reached Hannibal that his sanctuary had been betrayed. Roman agents were closing in on the villa where he was hiding. He didn't run this time. According to legend, Hannibal had long kept a vial of poison hidden in a ring, carried with him as insurance. If Rome ever cornered him like an animal, he would go out on his own terms. Now, the moment had come. He reportedly wrote a short message before taking the poison. "Let us relieve the Romans from their long anxiety, since they think it too tedious a task to wait for an old man's death." Just like that, it was over. Hannibal Barca, Rome's greatest nightmare, died not on a battlefield, but in a foreign land, hunted, exiled, and alone. And yet, even in death, Rome couldn't bury him. They destroyed his city, razed Carthage decades later in the Third Punic War, and salted its earth. But they never forgot him. Centuries later, Roman historians, men who should have hated him, wrote about his brilliance with awe. He had led from the front, fought against overwhelming odds, and outwitted every Roman general sent to kill him. He crossed the Alps with elephants, devastated Italy for years, and gave the greatest military machine in history a fear it would never shake. And he did it all while staying true to one thing, his boyhood oath, to never be a friend to Rome. Even in exile, even in death, Hannibal won a different kind of war, the war for legacy. And in that war, he remains undefeated. Every autumn in ancient Greece, a strange transformation would grip the land between Athens and the small town of Eleusis. Roads filled with chanting pilgrims, smoke and incense drifted through the hills, and somewhere in the darkness, under torchlight and secrecy, something sacred and forbidden took place. This was the Eleusinian Mysteries, the most famous and mysterious religious festival of the ancient world. It wasn't just a celebration. It was a spiritual initiation. And unlike the rowdy Dionysian orgies or the public pomp of Olympic festivals, this one came with rules. Ironclad rules. Break the silence, speak of what happened inside the sacred hall, and you could be executed. The core of the festival centered around Demeter, the goddess of the harvest, and her daughter Persephone. According to myth, Persephone was kidnapped by Hades, god of the underworld. Demeter, devastated, caused the world's crops to wither in mourning. Eventually, a deal was struck. Persephone would spend part of the year underground and part above. This myth became a powerful metaphor for the agricultural cycle. Death and rebirth, decay and renewal. But the mysteries weren't just agricultural, they were cosmic. To the Greeks, this wasn't just about farming, it was about the fate of the soul. Participants, known as maistai, underwent a multi-day journey. They fasted, they bathed in the sea, they carried sacred objects. And then, at Eleusis, they entered the Telesterion, a great hall where the innermost rites took place. What exactly they saw or experienced inside is still debated. Some think it involved a symbolic reenactment of Persephone's return. Others believe it was a visionary experience, perhaps aided by a hallucinogenic potion called Kykeon. Whatever it was, it left people changed. From emperors like Hadrian to philosophers like Plato, many of the greatest minds of antiquity went through the Eleusinian Mysteries and emerged convinced that death was not the end. This was religion not as obedience, but as transformation, a sacred encounter with the cycles of life, loss, and renewal. And for over 1,000 years, the Eleusinian Mysteries endured, longer than most empires. Until one day, Christianity rose, the old gods were outlawed, and the secrets of Eleusis were buried forever. No one ever broke the vow of silence. And so, the mystery lives on. While Greece cloaked its sacred rites in mystery, ancient Egypt preferred something far more spectacular: public religion on parade. And no festival embodied this more than the Opet Festival. Held annually in the grand city of Thebes, the Opet Festival was one of the most magnificent religious events in ancient Egypt. Its purpose? To rejuvenate the pharaoh's divine essence and reaffirm his sacred bond with the gods, especially Amun-Ra, the chief deity of Thebes. It began at the colossal temple of Karnak, home to the mighty god Amun, his wife Mut, and their son Khonsu, the Theban triad. Priests carried their sacred statues, sealed within golden shrines, onto ceremonial boats called barks. These weren't ordinary boats. They were massive, gilded, and often carried on the shoulders of dozens of priests through the streets. Later, they were floated down the Nile itself. Their destination? The Luxor Temple, about 2 kilometers away, linked to Karnak by a grand avenue lined with hundreds of sphinxes. The journey between the temples was not silent or solemn. It was vibrant, theatrical, and drenched in pageantry. Dancers, musicians, acrobats, and chanting priests filled the streets. Commoners came out in droves, not just to watch, but to participate. For many Egyptians, this was their chance to see the divine, not hidden in the inner sanctums of a temple, but paraded openly, proudly, and dazzlingly through the city. And this wasn't just ritual for show. The pharaoh himself joined the procession, often taking part in sacred reenactments. In some eras, it was believed the god Amun merged spiritually with the pharaoh during the ceremony, recharging his divine mandate to rule. It was a renewal of power, not through conquest, but through cosmic approval. There was also a deeply human element. During the festival, the strict boundaries between priest and peasant, god and mortal, loosened. People feasted, drank, danced. It was joy wrapped in divinity, a moment when heaven touched earth, however briefly. The Opet festival lasted anywhere from 11 to 27 days, depending on the period and the pharaoh's budget. And while each celebration had its own flavour, the message remained the same. Egypt was in balance, the gods were pleased, and the divine order of Ma'at still reigned. For the Egyptians, that meant everything. If the Eleusinian mysteries were about divine secrets and the Opet festival about royal divinity, then Saturnalia was something else entirely, a week-long party where Rome gleefully abandoned its rules. Held every December in honour of Saturn, the Roman god of agriculture, time and liberation, Saturnalia was a deeply rooted festival, celebrating the end of the harvest and a nostalgic longing for the mythical Golden Age, a time when Saturn ruled and all men were free and equal. And for a few chaotic days, Romans tried to relive that dream. It began with a sacrifice at the Temple of Saturn in the Forum, followed by a public feast. Then, all social norms were flipped on their heads. Masters served their slaves. Senators wore colourful tunics instead of togas. Gambling, usually banned, was openly permitted. Work stopped. Schools closed. The courts shut down. Rome didn't function, at least not in the usual sense. One of the festival's most bizarre traditions was the election of a Saturnalian king, sometimes called the Lord of Misrule. This was often a low-ranking citizen, a slave, or even a child, given mock authority to issue absurd commands. Sing naked in the streets. Balance a plate on your head. Obeying these ridiculous orders was part of the fun. Saturnalia was also when people exchanged gifts, wax candles, small figurines, and even poetry. It was light-hearted, full of laughter, and had a warmth that feels oddly familiar. In fact, many scholars argue that Saturnalia is one of the cultural ancestors of Christmas. The timing, the gift-giving, the candles, the feasting, it all echoes through time. But Saturnalia wasn't just a holiday. It was a pressure valve. For a society so rigidly structured, with slaves at the bottom and senators at the top, it allowed for the illusion, however brief, that everyone was equal. That maybe, just maybe, there could be a return to Saturn's mythical golden age. Of course, when the festival ended, everything snapped back into place. Slaves returned to servitude. The Senate resumed its bickering. The streets quieted. But for that week of reversal, Rome became a theatre of joy, chaos, and shared humanity. Because even an empire needs a break from pretending it has everything under control. Long before alarm clocks and New Year countdowns, ancient Persians were already celebrating a festival of rebirth, balance, and fire, one that still survives today. Novruz, the Persian New Year. Rooted in Zoroastrianism, one of the world's oldest monotheistic religions, Novruz wasn't just about turning a calendar page. It marked the spring equinox, a moment when day and night are perfectly balanced. To Zoroastrians, this balance reflected the eternal struggle between Ahura Mazda, the force of light and order, and Angra Mainyu, darkness and chaos. Nowruz symbolized victory of light over dark, of cleanliness over corruption, and hope over despair. Preparation began weeks in advance. Homes were swept, walls washed, debts settled. This wasn't just spring cleaning, it was a spiritual purge. Everything dirty or chaotic had to go. Fires were lit in courtyards and along city walls. On the eve of the new year, people would leap over flames, shouting, "Give me your red colour, take away my sickness." The fire, sacred in Zoroastrian belief, wasn't just heat and light, it was purification. Then came the Haft scene table, an altar-like arrangement of 7 symbolic items beginning with the Persian letter S. Sabzeh, sprouted greens for growth, seer, garlic for protection, senjed, dried fruit for love, serke, vinegar for wisdom, and more. Each item represented a moral or cosmic value. Temples, called fire temples, held special ceremonies during this period. Zoroastrian priests in white robes chanted hymns from the Avesta, their holy texts, and offered fragrant woods to the ever-burning sacred flame. For believers, it was a time to reflect, to realign with truth, Asha, and to embrace the turning of the cosmic wheel. But Nowruz wasn't just solemn, it was joyous. Families gathered, tables overflowed with food, children received gifts, and musicians filled streets with drums and flutes. For a society that prized cosmic order, this was a moment when everything reset, not just the year, but the soul. Nowruz outlived empires. It was celebrated by the Achaemenids, the Parthians, the Sassanids, and it continues today across Iran, Central Asia, and beyond. Few ancient religious festivals have endured this long, but then again, few are built so elegantly around something as universal and eternal as light returning to the world. In ancient Athens, worship didn't always mean incense and silence. Sometimes it meant masks, wine, and a god who knew how to throw a party. Dionysus, god of wine, fertility, theatre, and sacred madness. And no festival captured his chaotic brilliance like the Great Dionysia. Held every spring, this festival wasn't some fringe cult celebration. It was one of the most important public events in the Athenian calendar. It honoured Dionysus not through animal sacrifice or solemn chants, but through drama, tragedy and comedy performed in his name. It began with a procession through the city. Citizens carried giant phallic symbols, yes, really, waved ivy-covered staffs, and chanted hymns as they led a statue of Dionysus to the theatre of Dionysus at the foot of the Acropolis. There were flutes, dancers, and a tidal wave of wine-fueled enthusiasm. Then came the performances. Over several days, playwrights competed in a sacred contest, presenting 3 tragedies and 1 satyr play each. These weren't casual shows. They were state-sponsored events, judged by elite citizens, and watched by up to 15,000 people at a time. Attendance was civic duty. Even prisoners could be released on bail to attend. The themes: gods, fate, hubris, revenge, war, and suffering. Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides. These masters told stories that ripped the soul open. Imagine watching Oedipus discover he married his mother with your neighbours beside you, gasping in horror. It wasn't just entertainment, it was ritual catharsis. And after the tragedies came the comedies, raunchy, political, and often absurd. Aristophanes used them to mock politicians, question war, and skewer society itself. Nothing was off limits, but at its core, Dionysia was about more than theatre. It was about stepping out of yourself, about breaking down the masks society forces us to wear, and putting on literal ones to explore truths we couldn't otherwise say aloud. It was madness with meaning. Dionysus wasn't a calm, orderly god. He was wild, untamed, a bridge between civilization and its primal roots. The Dionysia gave space for that side of humanity to breathe, shout, laugh, and grieve. For the Athenians, this wasn't escape. This was religion. A mirror held up to the soul, with a wine cup in hand, and the god of ecstatic transformation watching from the wings. Among ancient religious festivals, few are as raucous, theatrical, and subversively spiritual as Purim, a Jewish holiday that's part survival story, part political satire, and all about divine irony. Purim commemorates the events told in the Book of Esther, set in the Persian Empire under King Ahasuerus, likely Xerxes I. The plot sounds almost like a drama from the Great Dionysia. A Jewish girl named Esther becomes queen, hides her identity, and eventually risks her life to stop a genocidal plot by the king's advisor, Haman, to annihilate the Jews. She succeeds. Haman is hanged on his own gallows, and the Jewish people are saved. It's a story about reversal of fate, the hidden workings of providence, and the power of courage. But unlike solemn religious festivals, Purim is pure, unfiltered joy, a celebration of survival that leans into laughter and liberation. The festival begins with the public reading of the Megillah, Book of Esther, often performed like a comedic play. Every time Haman's name is mentioned, the crowd drowns it out with graggers, noisemakers, booze, and shouting. Children dress up as Esther, Mordecai, or even Haman. Costumes and chaos are encouraged. Then come the commandments of celebration, feasting with lavish meals, gifting food to friends, giving to the poor, and most famously, drinking until you can't distinguish between blessed is Mordecai and cursed is Haman. Yes, that's actually written in the Talmud, but behind the festivity lies something profound. Unlike other Jewish holidays, God is never mentioned by name in the Book of Esther, not once. It's the only book in the Hebrew Bible with that distinction. This absence forces readers to look for hidden divine intervention, a lesson in faith without direct revelation. Purim teaches that even when miracles don't look like parted seas or fire from heaven, they can still unfold behind palace doors through courage, risk, and unlikely heroes. So people celebrate with parody, masks, satire, and storytelling. They laugh in the face of death. They mock the villain. And in doing so, they affirm something deeply spiritual. Survival is sacred, and joy is resistance. In the misty hills and forested valleys of ancient Ireland, the beginning of August marked a sacred and deeply communal event. Lugnasad, pronounced Lunasa, the Celtic festival honouring Lugh, the god of light, craftsmanship, and war. Unlike the grand temple festivals of Rome or Egypt, Lugnasad was celebrated outdoors, on hilltops, in fields, and by sacred wells. It wasn't about imperial spectacle. It was about the land, the harvest, and the fragile bargain between humans and nature. Lugh, the namesake of the festival, was a solar deity, a shining warrior and master of all arts. But Lugnasad wasn't just about worshipping him directly. According to myth, Lugh held the first festival to honour his foster mother, Tailtiu, who died from exhaustion after clearing the plains of Ireland to make way for farmland. In her honour, people gathered to give thanks for the first grain harvest and to ensure the earth would continue to provide. So how did they celebrate? It started with a ceremonial cutting of the first sheaf of grain, followed by offerings to the gods and spirits of the land. This wasn't just symbolic. If the harvest failed, winter would be cruel. Gratitude and ritual were a form of spiritual insurance. But Lugnasad was also a social explosion. People travelled for miles to participate in fairs, markets, competitions, and athletic games, often referred to as the Tailteann Games, a kind of mystical precursor to the Olympics. Contests included running, wrestling, horse racing, and even feats of poetry and storytelling. It was also a prime time for trial marriages. Couples could commit to a union that lasted a year and a day. If it didn't work out, they could walk away, literally, by standing back to back and walking in opposite directions. The gods, apparently, had no issue with prenups. There were bonfires, feasting, and dancing on sacred hills. But always, beneath the revelry, was a humbling awareness. Nature gives, and nature takes. Lugnasad was both a celebration and a warning, a time to enjoy the first fruits, but also to begin preparing for darker days ahead. In a world ruled by seasons, this festival marked the shift from sunlight to shadow. The wheat was in hand, but winter was already watching. In the heart of the Indian subcontinent, as winter melts into spring, an explosion of colour, music, and fire erupts across villages, towns, and cities. It's loud, it's wild, it's sacred. This is Holi, one of the most joyful and symbolic festivals in ancient Hindu tradition. Known today for its clouds of coloured powder and water fights, Holi has deep religious and mythological roots. At its core, it celebrates the victory of good over evil, the arrival of spring, and the burning away of the old to make room for renewal. The festival begins the night before the colour, with Holika Dahan, the ceremonial bonfire. Its origins lie in the myth of Prahlada, a devout follower of the god Vishnu, and his demon father Hiranyakashipu, who demanded to be worshipped instead. When Prahlada refused, his father conspired to kill him by placing him on the lap of his sister Holika, who was immune to fire. But divine justice had other plans. Holika burned, and Prahlada emerged unharmed. Every year, Holika's effigy is burned in bonfires across India. The fire symbolizes the destruction of ego, hatred, and evil, and the cleansing of the soul through light and heat. And then comes the colour. The next morning, the streets transform into a living kaleidoscope. People throw gulal, vibrant coloured powders, at each other, drench friends with coloured water, and dance to drums and flutes. It's impossible to stay clean or sombre. But this chaos is ritual chaos. Social boundaries collapse. Rich and poor, old and young, men and women, all become equals under layers of red, green, blue, and yellow. Enemies reconcile. Strangers become companions. For one day, the world becomes unrecognizable, and beautifully so. Holi also connects to the legend of Krishna and Radha, where Krishna, self-conscious about his dark skin, playfully smeared colour on Radha's fair face. Their divine romance became an eternal metaphor for playful love and divine unity. That's why Holi isn't just fire and purification. It's flirtation, joy, and affection. Underneath the celebration is a spiritual message, the cycle of seasons, the resilience of the soul, and the beauty in embracing impermanence. Because after the flames die down and the colours fade from your skin, what remains is the lesson Holi was always trying to teach. Light returns. Joy is sacred. And rebirth is always just around the corner. Amid the thunder of Roman armies and the pomp of imperial parades, there existed a ritual so secret, so exclusive, that even Rome's most powerful men were banned from attending. No senators, no priests, no emperors, only women. This was the festival of Bonadea, the good goddess. Held each December at the home of Rome's highest magistrate, the festival was both religious and mysterious. It honoured a goddess associated with fertility, healing, chastity, and the earth, but her exact origins and functions remain elusive. And that's by design. Everything about Bonadea was cloaked in feminine secrecy. The rites were conducted by the Vestal Virgins, Rome's most sacred priestesses, and attended only by elite Roman women. Men were strictly forbidden, not just from participating, but even from knowing the rituals. In fact, not even male historians knew what happened during the ceremony. What we do know comes from scandal. In 62 BCE, the festival exploded into public controversy. That year, Julius Caesar, then Pontifex Maximus, was hosting the rites in his home, as required, even though he couldn't attend. But his wife, Pompeia, was in charge of hosting the female-only celebration. Things took a turn when a reckless aristocrat named Publius Clodius Pulcher disguised himself as a woman and sneaked into the ceremony, allegedly to seduce Pompeia. He was caught. A trial followed, turning a private, sacred ritual into a public spectacle. Although Clodius was acquitted, likely through bribery, Caesar divorced Pompeia, famously declaring that Caesar's wife must be above suspicion. But beyond scandal, the Bonadea festival reveals something rare, a sacred space entirely controlled by women, where their concerns, fertility, health, family, the rhythms of the body, were placed at the center of religious life. It was a moment when Rome's rigid patriarchy stepped aside, and the divine feminine reigned in secret. Wreaths of myrtle were banned, a symbol of Venus and, possibly, sexual love. Wine was disguised as milk. Music, incense, and offerings were made, perhaps even symbolic fertility rites. But no man ever saw them. No man ever would. And maybe that's the point. In a world that documented everything, the most powerful rituals were the ones no one wrote down. Because sometimes the sacred must remain unseen, protected by silence, and passed down only through whispered memory. Long before it became a medieval obsession with turning lead into gold, alchemy began in the temples and tombs of ancient Egypt. But in Egypt, it wasn't called alchemy. It was known as chemia, meaning the black art, a reference not to anything sinister, but to the rich, dark soil of the Nile Valley, known as Kemet, the Black Land. To the Egyptians, transformation wasn't just physical, it was sacred. It applied not only to matter, but to the soul. The ancient Egyptians were already masters of practical chemistry. They produced cosmetics, perfumes, glass, dyes, and metal alloys. They practiced advanced techniques in embalming, using resins, salts, and linen to preserve the body for eternity. But these weren't just medical procedures. These were rituals of transformation, performed with divine intent. Every act of mummification, every pigment ground into paint, was part of a cosmic process, the preparation of the body and soul for rebirth in the afterlife. In fact, death itself was seen as a kind of alchemical operation. Just as metals could be purified in fire, the soul of the dead had to be refined through trials in the underworld. The Book of the Dead, full of spells and incantations, acted like a guide for this spiritual transmutation. Central to Egyptian thought was the figure of Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom, writing, and sacred knowledge. Later, when Greek and Egyptian cultures fused during the Ptolemaic period, Thoth was identified with the Greek god Hermes, creating the mythical sage Hermes Trismegistus, thrice great Hermes. He would become the legendary author of the Hermetic texts, mystical writings that laid the foundation for alchemy as a spiritual science. These texts spoke not just of material processes, but of divine unity, of the correspondence between the macrocosm and microcosm, as above, so below. In Egyptian alchemy, the transformation of matter was symbolic of the transformation of the soul. Turning base metals into gold was just a metaphor for turning an imperfect self into a purified being. So, when later alchemists in Greece and Europe searched for the philosopher's stone or eternal life, they were really carrying forward an ancient Egyptian idea. That true transformation doesn't begin in the lab. It begins in the heart. While Egypt gave alchemy its ritual soul, ancient Persia gave it a moral spine, a cosmic framework rooted in the eternal struggle between light and darkness. In the heart of the Persian Empire, long before medieval laboratories, the teachings of Zoroaster, Zarathustra, shaped a worldview where transformation was not only desirable, it was necessary. His dualistic vision split the universe into two opposing forces: Ahura Mazda, the god of light, truth, and order, and Angra Mainyu, the spirit of darkness and chaos. This wasn't just myth, it was metaphysics, and it deeply influenced alchemical thinking. Zoroastrians worshipped through fire, a living symbol of truth and divine illumination. In temples, sacred flames were never allowed to die. Fire purified, revealed, and transformed, just like the alchemist's furnace centuries later. Persians also developed advanced metalworking techniques. They were among the first to refine copper, silver, and gold, to smelt iron, and to experiment with alloys. Their artisans weren't just craftsmen. They were seen as initiates in a process of perfecting nature. Smelting ore into shining metal was viewed as an act of cosmic alignment, elevating raw, chaotic matter into something orderly and pure. Even the earliest Persian medicinal texts show traces of proto-alchemical ideas, lists of minerals, metals, plants, and their effects on the human body. They didn't just want to heal the body, they wanted to align it with the divine harmony of the universe. Later, Islamic scholars would preserve and expand on Persian alchemical ideas. But even in pre-Islamic times, we see the emergence of a powerful theme that would echo through alchemical traditions, from Arabia to Europe, that matter is not static, and that within every impure substance lies the seed of perfection. It's the same idea that would later inspire alchemists to transmute lead into gold, or the soul from base to divine. Persian thought, then, offered a moral alchemy, purification not just of elements, but of intention. Fire didn't simply melt metals, it burned away falsehood and revealed what was hidden. And in that hidden core, somewhere between smoke and spirit, Persian alchemists believed lay the divine spark that could change anything, even the self. If Egypt gave alchemy its sacred rites and Persia its moral framework, it was ancient Greece that tried to explain it all, with logic, geometry, and a touch of cosmic arrogance. Here, alchemy didn't vanish, it evolved. Greek thinkers took the mystical and chemical traditions of older civilizations and tried to make them make sense. But instead of crucibles and powders, they reached for philosophy. At the heart of Greek alchemical thought was the theory of four elements: earth, water, air, and fire, first proposed by Empedocles. These weren't just physical substances, they were fundamental principles of the universe, the Lego blocks of reality. Change, according to this view, was simply the rearrangement of these elements. Fire could become air, water could become earth, and all things were in a constant dance of transformation. Later philosophers like Plato added layers of meaning. He described matter as composed of perfect geometrical forms, tiny, invisible solids. In this version, alchemy became a quest not just for chemical reactions, but for harmony with the ideal world. Then came Aristotle, who altered everything. He proposed that all matter had four essential qualities: hot, cold, wet, and dry. By changing these qualities, you could change the substance itself. Lead was dry and heavy, gold was balanced and radiant. So if you could shift lead's properties, make it more noble, it could, in theory, become gold. Sound familiar? This idea of transmutation, changing one substance into another, became the cornerstone of all later alchemy. But the Greeks didn't stop at theory. In Hellenistic Alexandria, a melting pot of Egyptian mysticism, Greek philosophy, and Babylonian astronomy, alchemy as a practice finally began to take shape. Here, scholars and mystics recorded early recipes for dyes, perfumes, and metal alloys, but always wrapped in symbolic language. And it's here that the mythic figure of Hermes Trismegistus emerged, part Egyptian Thoth, part Greek Hermes, credited with writing the Hermetic corpus. These texts spoke of purifying not just matter, but the soul, urging practitioners to seek divine union through inner transformation. To the Greeks, alchemy wasn't about making money. It was about understanding nature, mirroring the cosmos, and perfecting the self through the hidden laws of reality. And that made it not just science, but something dangerously close to divine power. In the bustling port city of Alexandria, alchemy found its true laboratory, not just of matter, but of ideas. Founded by Alexander the Great and ruled by the Ptolemies, Alexandria was where Greek rationalism, Egyptian ritual, Babylonian astrology, and Persian metaphysics collided in a swirling intellectual stew. At its heart was the great library of Alexandria, a beacon of ancient knowledge, where scrolls and scholars gathered from across the known world. Alchemy, in this environment, didn't just survive, it thrived. It was here that alchemy became both spiritual and practical, mystical and experimental. Egyptian temple rites merged with Greek natural philosophy. Babylonian star charts were studied alongside Greek medicine and Egyptian metallurgy. The result? A new kind of knowledge, half science, half sacrament. One of the earliest and most mysterious figures of Alexandrian alchemy was Mary the Jewess. She's credited with inventing some of the first alchemical apparatus, the bain-marie, a double boiler still used in kitchens today, the tribicos, a distillation device, and a system of vapor purification. Her work suggests that alchemists weren't just theorizing, they were conducting real chemical experiments. Another key figure was Zosimos of Panopolis, a 3rd-4th century CE alchemist, who left behind some of the earliest known writings on alchemy in Greek. But Zosimos didn't see alchemy as just physical. He wrote of dreams, visions, and spiritual purification. For him, turning lead into gold was a metaphor for turning the corrupted human soul into something divine. He described the alchemical vessel not just as a container for substances, but as a symbol of the body. The fire, the soul's inner torment, the vapor, the divine essence rising. His writings blurred the line between chemistry and mysticism, matter and metaphor. Alexandrian alchemists also leaned heavily on Hermeticism, the teachings of Hermes Trismegistus. As above, so below, they wrote. The microcosm reflects the macrocosm. Purify one, and you touch the other. In Alexandria, alchemy was no longer just about materials. It was about reality itself. It asked not just what things were made of, but why they could change, and whether the soul could be transformed alongside matter. Alchemy had become a mirror of the cosmos, and of ourselves, and it was only just getting started. When the great library of Alexandria fell into ruin, and Europe slipped into the early Middle Ages, it was the Islamic world that became the new guardian of alchemical knowledge. From the 8th to the 13th centuries, under the Abbasid Caliphate, the Islamic Golden Age turned cities like Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba into centers of scientific and philosophical inquiry. Greek, Persian, and Indian texts were translated into Arabic at record pace, and among them were the foundational writings of alchemy. But here's the twist. Islamic scholars didn't just preserve ancient alchemy, they transformed it. Enter Jabir ibn Hayyan, known in the West as Geber. A polymath working in 8th century Kufa, he's often called the father of chemistry, though his legacy is steeped in mystery. Jabir's writings, which number in the hundreds, blended Greek elemental theory, Persian mysticism, and Quranic cosmology into a structured science. He introduced a systematic approach to experimentation. He believed all metals were composed of sulfur and mercury, not in the literal sense, but as principles. Sulfur representing combustion and change, mercury standing for liquidity and volatility. According to Jabir, if you could balance these two forces, you could transmute one metal into another. He also introduced techniques still recognizable today: distillation, crystallization, sublimation, filtration, and calcination. His apparatuses became the blueprint for medieval laboratories. But Islamic alchemy wasn't just technical. It retained the spiritual heart of earlier traditions. Alchemy was seen as a path to divine understanding. Transforming matter was a metaphor for purifying the soul, aligning with God's order in the universe. Later alchemists like Al-Razi, Rhazes, and Avicenna, Ibn Sina, debated alchemy's legitimacy. Al-Razi supported it, emphasizing its practical medical applications. Avicenna, on the other hand, criticized the idea of transmutation, but respected the discipline's philosophical and ethical aims. Even in disagreement, they elevated alchemy into something more than a secretive craft. It became proto-chemistry, metaphysics, spiritual discipline, and moral philosophy, all in one. European scholars would later rediscover these Arabic texts, translating them into Latin and reviving alchemy in the West. But the soul of that alchemy, the belief that matter and spirit mirrored each other, was preserved, clarified, and systematized by Muslim scholars. And in their hands, alchemy stopped being legend and started becoming science. When the translated works of Arabic alchemists like Jabir ibn Hayyan, al-Razi and Avicenna flowed into Europe during the 12th century, something remarkable happened. A revival of alchemy, this time under the shadowed stone towers of medieval monasteries and universities. Europe had been in intellectual hibernation, but with the rise of translation schools in places like Toledo and Sicily, Latin scholars gained access to a treasure trove of forgotten wisdom. Among these were the alchemical writings, riddled with strange symbols, mysterious ingredients, and promises of transformation. The Europeans were hooked. To them, alchemy offered more than gold. It offered knowledge, power, and even immortality. The elusive philosopher's stone became the Holy Grail, said to transmute base metals into gold and bestow eternal life. But it wasn't just a material object. It symbolized the perfection of both matter and spirit. Medieval alchemists took this dual nature seriously. Figures like Albertus Magnus and Roger Bacon were both friars and experimental scientists. They believed that God had encoded the secrets of creation into the natural world, and that alchemy was a way to read that divine script. For them, alchemy wasn't sorcery. It was Christian natural philosophy, a means to understand the divine order through the transformation of substances. Laboratories became monastic cloisters of fire and glass. Retorts, alembics, crucibles, and furnaces filled with substances like sulfur, mercury, antimony, and lead. Experiments were recorded in coded texts, full of allegory and metaphor, a tradition that made alchemy seem arcane and impenetrable. But beneath the symbolism, serious work was being done. One of the most influential figures of this period was Pseudo-Geber, a mysterious Latin writer who adapted Arabic works into European forms. His books became standard references for later alchemists. Another key name was Arnold of Villanova, who blurred the lines between medicine and alchemy, focusing on creating elixirs that could heal and rejuvenate the body. For all its secrecy, medieval alchemy wasn't underground. It was debated in universities, sponsored by princes and practiced by priests. Yet, despite its spiritual ambitions, many still chased the gold, sometimes literally, sometimes metaphorically. And so, medieval Europe kept the flame of transformation burning, one part faith, one part fire, and one part philosophical dream. As Europe emerged from the medieval era into the Renaissance, alchemy didn't fade, it morphed. It became more secretive, more symbolic, and strangely more mystical. Out of this fusion of Hermetic philosophy, Christian mysticism, and Renaissance humanism emerged one of the most curious movements in alchemical history, the Rosicrucians. In the early 1600s, anonymous manifestos began circulating across Europe. Fama Fraternitatis, Confessio Fraternitatis, and the chemical wedding of Christian Rosenkreuz. These texts told the story of a hidden brotherhood, the Fraternity of the Rosy Cross, founded by a mythical figure named Christian Rosenkreuz, who had journeyed through the East, learning secret wisdom before returning to Europe to quietly guide spiritual seekers. But here's the twist. There's no evidence the Rosicrucians existed as an actual organization, at least not at first. They were an idea, a symbol, and their influence was profound. Rosicrucian alchemy was not about making gold. It was about enlightenment. It combined alchemical transformation with Christian esotericism, seeing the purification of metals as a metaphor for the purification of the soul. The philosopher's stone became a symbol for Christ consciousness, inner rebirth, and union with the divine. Their manifestos promised a reformation of science, religion, and politics, a secret spiritual revolution that would lead humanity into a new golden age. But they offered no addresses, no names, no leaders, just symbols: the rose, secrecy and beauty, and the cross, sacrifice and transformation. This was alchemy as spiritual allegory, rich in metaphor, full of veiled references. The Rosicrucians believed that truth was hidden, not because it was forbidden, but because it had to be earned through personal transformation. Their ideas influenced scientists, mystics, artists, and poets. Isaac Newton owned Rosicrucian texts. Johann Valentin Andrea, thought to be the author of The Chemical Wedding, saw the story as allegory, yet it spread like wildfire through occult circles. By now, alchemy had become layered with meaning. To some, it was still about materials. To others, it was pure metaphor. To the Rosicrucians, it was a spiritual path, hidden in plain sight. And though their brotherhood may have been mythical, their influence was very real, whispering through the centuries that the true gold is within. As the 17th century unfolded, alchemy began rubbing shoulders with something unexpected: modern science. But it wasn't a clean break. The line between alchemist and chemist was blurred, and many of the figures who built the scientific method were, paradoxically, still chasing the philosopher's stone. One of the most famous examples, Isaac Newton. Yes, the same man who formulated the laws of motion and gravitation spent more time in his life studying alchemy than physics. In secret, Newton filled notebooks with arcane experiments, analysing ancient symbols and attempting to uncover the divine mechanics of the universe. To him, the cosmos was a divine machine, and alchemy was a language written in fire and gold to understand it. Newton wasn't alone. Robert Boyle, often called the father of modern chemistry, was also steeped in alchemical thought. His famous 1661 book, The Skeptical Chymist, challenged the classical four-element theory and laid the groundwork for chemical analysis. But Boyle also believed in the transmutation of metals and saw alchemy as a valid field of inquiry. So, what changed? The key difference was methodology. Alchemy had long been shrouded in symbolism, secrecy, and spiritual metaphor. But emerging scientists began demanding clarity, repeatability, and evidence. They started shedding the mystical language in favour of quantifiable results. The laboratory, once a place of occult wonder, became a space of measurable reaction and precision tools. Alchemical instruments, crucibles, alembics, furnaces, evolved into the backbone of modern chemistry. The dream of turning lead into gold faded, replaced by the practical pursuit of understanding matter's building blocks. And yet, the alchemical worldview didn't entirely disappear. The notion that matter can transform, that systems contain hidden patterns, and that humans can shape the natural world through deep understanding, these alchemical ideas quietly endured. They simply dressed in lab coats instead of robes. By the 18th century, alchemy was largely dismissed as pseudoscience. But history isn't so tidy. The truth is, modern science was built on alchemical bones, and the alchemists, with all their strange symbols and impossible dreams, did more than tinker with metals. They asked the fundamental question, can the world be changed? And that question still drives science today. By the 19th century, alchemy had seemingly vanished, dismissed by rational thinkers as a quaint relic of pre-scientific superstition. But like mercury in a flask, its essence never truly disappeared. Instead, alchemy transmuted, finding new life in psychology, literature, art, and even modern spirituality. The most surprising inheritor of alchemical thought? Carl Jung, the Swiss psychologist. To Jung, alchemy wasn't about literal transmutation. It was a symbolic map of the human psyche. He studied alchemical texts obsessively, recognizing in their cryptic diagrams and metaphors a language of the unconscious. The philosopher's stone became a symbol of self-actualization. The alchemical process, calcination, dissolution, fermentation, coagulation, mirrored the psychological journey toward individuation, the integration of all aspects of the self. Alchemy, Jung believed, was the original therapy, a coded spiritual practice disguised as proto-chemistry. Its real aim wasn't to make gold, but to heal the soul. And in this sense, alchemy never stopped evolving. In literature, it lives on in works like Faust, The Alchemist, and countless fantasy stories where hidden knowledge, transformation, and redemption take center stage. In modern spirituality, alchemy serves as a metaphor for personal growth. The idea that life's suffering, if refined, can produce wisdom and wholeness. Even in science, echoes remain. The dream of alchemy, to understand and master the transformation of matter, finds a curious reflection in nuclear physics, where elements really can be transmuted. The alchemists were wrong about how it works, but not that it was possible, and culturally we still chase alchemical goals, the search for a cure-all medicine, the pursuit of eternal youth. The fascination with the hidden, the symbolic, the transformative, the enduring power of alchemy lies not in its failed recipes, but in its imagination. Its willingness to believe that the world is mutable, that what is base can become noble, and that knowledge, properly applied, can elevate both matter and soul. Alchemy didn't die. It simply changed form. It became chemistry. It became psychology. It became story. It became metaphor. And in some ways, it became you. Because every time you struggle, grow, suffer, refine, and emerge stronger, you're performing your own little alchemy. Not in gold, but in spirit. And that was always the real magic.
Freshly caught this morning. A fine selection for you.
Thank you, sir. Here are the herbs we agreed upon in exchange.
Our scouts report impassable terrain here.
The ancient texts suggest a passage through the northern mountains.
This wine is excellent, my friend. A very fine vintage indeed. We give thanks for this bounty, and may the harvest be plentiful and the kingdom prosperous.
The route is clear now. Look here.
I see it. We must leave at once.
O Lord, hear my prayer. Grant us your divine mercy in this time of need.
I beg you to reconsider this unjust taxation on my family's lands. We cannot pay it without starving.
See the light, the glory unfolding. The heavens open up before us.
You must listen closely to what I am about to reveal. The future of our kingdom depends on your obedience and unwavering loyalty.
Pull it down, get inside!
Light it up! Charge! Forward to victory!
The delegates from the north have finally arrived.
Let us hope they come bearing good news.
This alliance must be sealed by dawn, regardless of the cost.
The gods will curse this union. I forbid it!
All right, one moment, please. Here you go, watch the steam.
The alignment of the stars dictates our next harvest. We must follow the ancient texts precisely if we wish to thrive.
This is the only viable route, Commander.
Agreed. We concentrate our forces here at the river crossing.
You stand accused of treason against the crown.
How can you deny this? Look at his guilt.
I swear my loyalty, my king. Another spoonful of the stew for you, my friend. And pass the bread while it's warm.
We must speak softly. The others are watching. Do not worry. The arrangement is secure.
Your reading of the text ignores the context of our suffering.
Context does not supersede divine law, brother. We must hold fast to the traditions.
If they find us here, we are finished.
Quiet now, they might hear us. Just keep watching the darkness. By the grace of God, we return to our rightful lands. Let the banners fly and the trumpets sound our victory.
should be thankful for this bounty. Few travelers find such comfort these days.
To that, we agree.
Drink deeply from the cup of life. To Bacchus and to our host.
Magnificent feast. Let us drink to the harvest and good fortune. Pull the ropes evenly. Mind the mechanism.
Watch yourselves below! Clear the way!
Guard the silver.
along now. Hup.
These frescoes remind us that glory is fleeting, but wisdom endures.
And yet, how...
We sing praises to the eternal light forever.